Hey there, and welcome back to another episode of the BB Marketing Asia podcast. I'm your host, Joe Escobedo, and joining me is a friend and former colleague, Lipika Subaya, who is now the Global Coaching Program Manager, Blueprint Center of Excellence at LinkedIn. Lipika, one of the things that I want to hear your thoughts on is around enterprise selling. And we'll start off with what are some of the things that are not working in 2022, and then we'll flip the script and we'll talk about what you have been very effective when it comes to enterprise sales. So let's start with what are some of the things that you haven't seen are quite as effective this year when it comes to enterprise sales?
I love that question. One of the things that is not working, I don't know that it ever has, but one of the things that's working even less now than it has before is just pushing product, rushing a sale, just trying to get to the top. That has not worked before, and it's really not working now. People want a partnership. People want to build relationships. Much more, I think, in this environment where relationships and trusts are so important. People are looking for a connection. And so the good old product pushing, more than ever, is just such an outdated approach.
I was just having this conversation this morning with a friend and someone who was on the podcast previously. I'll have to share this with her. We were just talking about how she receives a lot of direct messages as a very senior marketer. And she's saying, I'm getting flooded with all these product promotions and people just saying, hey, book a call with me next Wednesday at whatever time. And it's just, she put something on LinkedIn. So yeah, I think a lot of executives can, relate to that as a recipient. And it goes back to what LinkedIn is known for, networks matter and things like that. But if that is obviously something that is not working, what are some of the things that have been effective when it comes to sales in 2022 and maybe beyond?
One of the things that's really working is thinking big, and it goes back to that partnership concept. We just closed a really big deal over here in APAC with a company I will not name. But when we were doing a postmortem of that win and looking at what was it that really helped us win that big with quite a complicated organization, is that the sellers really deep. They spent 2 years learning about this organization. It was an existing customer, so they were working with them, but they invested the time to really get to know the customer, met with a lot of people, really understood their business. And when it was time to go big with them, they presented a solution that covered a really broad part of the business and some aspects that the customer didn't even know that we could help with. So I think that's a really good example of where you're thinking partnership and how you can help the customer versus just what you can sell them. So I think that's really important. And I think the other thing that they did really well, which is just part of selling really big, is building relationships, both wide and deep. So it used to be you could just go straight to the top, get that meeting with the CEO, and they would sign off on your deal. And today it's all about that consistent selling. And so you just look at, I think it was almost 40 people in that customer organization they had relationships with, and that's complex selling for you today.
Yeah, absolutely. As you said, sometimes a sales cycle can take 2, maybe 3 years when it comes to enterprise sales. I guess the question for a lot of salespeople, and when I was having this very morning with a global tech company, is how do you balance that with quarterly targets? That's what most salespeople are focused on. They're focusing on just making sure they're hitting their numbers so they keep their job that quarter. How do you balance that with, like you said, a 2-year sales cycle if it is a new business, not necessarily an existing business?
Oh, yeah, it's a really good question, and it's a fine balance, isn't it? So my answer to that is twofold. And one is to have enough of those opportunities in your pipeline so that it's not you're working on one deal and then you start with the second, so you have nothing in between. So it's like having that always be pipelining is what we would say in sales. So it's having enough opportunities like that are ongoing so that when the time comes, you have that big deal and then you have a next one that is getting there. So I think that's really a big one. And then of course, the other thing is to deliver that incremental value. so that you're seeing pockets of proven success that you can build on. Like these days, people don't want to take a big risk and go really big right away. They want to start, they want to see success, they want to start small. And then that's a good way of hitting your quarterly targets. So you're starting small, you're doing those pilots with them, you're having small engagements where people just want to test and make sure they're getting value from your product. And so I think those are two ways to do it.
I think it's great advice. And one we've fallen into is the thing about pilots. We've started many pilots that started as something very small, but because those did well, they've grown to massive deals over 3 to 5 years. And so I think you're spot on in closing some of those pilot deals and getting some revenue generated within that quarter, and then looking at it from a longer term perspective, like you said. I want to go back to two different things you talked about, one of which, the previous example, you talked about learning. So how do you learn more about existing either accounts or people within accounts? And before I forget, the second question I want to ask you is around pipeline. People are constantly wondering, how do I get more pipeline? Should it come from marketing? Should sales be generating it? But maybe we start with the previous example around learning. What's your advice for learning more about specific accounts or specific people within those accounts? Obviously LinkedIn, but maybe within LinkedIn or outside of LinkedIn, what's your advice?
So that is a really big question. How much time do we have? That's a big one. The way that I would do it is, first of all, to map out my stakeholders. And that's a big project in itself. But first, knowing who do I need to talk to, that's a really good place to start. And then the next step for me would be doing research. And I love LinkedIn, and I would say LinkedIn is great. It's not enough. So we want all of those different resources that we can tap into. External research on LinkedIn, relationships that we have, like really do that broad research, everything that we can learn about the customer before talking to them. That's something that we need to do. And I think for me, once I've mapped out who are the people that I really want to be speaking to, getting really deep into their world. What do they care about? And taking time to understand that. And so that's part of the research process. And for me, it's always been a really important one, because that's how we can be relevant to people, when we understand what they care about.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. I'm curious when it comes to, mapping out stakeholders, what's your process to do that? Because generally you have the typical one. So in my space, it's the marketing and sales head. So that's pretty obvious. But sometimes maybe it's procurement if it's involved, if it's over a certain amount, or maybe some other head has to get involved. So what's your process about really having a clear stakeholder map?
Yeah, so this is a complicated topic, and the easiest answer would be to say it depends. But I'll try to give you a better answer than that. So the way that I was trained to do it is to focus on what your field of play is. So your field of play would be your opportunity that has a single budget. So if you're looking to sell at a certain scale, at that scale, who are the people involved? So maybe big company like P&G or Nestle, or like these are huge companies. They're trying to map the entire organization, would just be futile. So what's that field of play that you're looking to sell to that has a budget? Mapping that out. So I would do it in a bite-sized way so that it's manageable. And then if you see that you've had a pilot, it's going so well, and you want to scale, then we need to revisit that map and then do more work and talk to more people. So looking at who am I trying to sell to now, mapping that out, and then doing it, bit by bit, because you could have several different opportunities in one big account. So just doing it piece by piece.
I think that makes a lot of sense, because even if we look at the way our business is set up, we have some very large clients, and not all of the stuff that we do is applicable to them. So we focus more on the B2B MarTech side. Now, obviously, if you're a global tech company, that's only going to be a certain percentage of your business. So it doesn't make sense to map out all 500 or 1,000 marketing and sales staff. It only makes sense to focus on, like you said, your field of play. Where can you add the most value to that specific organization? Yeah, really good advice. It's taken me a couple of years to realize that. So I wish we had the conversation earlier.
It took me a lot of years and I'm still figuring it out. So I think it's a complex, but it's an important one because it helps us prioritize.
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, it's about prioritization. And the other question I wanted to ask you was around pipeline. Now, pipeline is a question I get all the time when in the B2B space. What's your thoughts on pipeline generation? Do you feel like marketing should be driving most of the pipeline, or do you feel like that should be something the sales should be doing? If it is a sales activity, what are some of the activities that they should be doing to encourage and drive more pipeline?
Yeah. So my perspective is as a salesperson, like, I own my pipeline. Like if I get leads from marketing, that's gravy, that's great. But I see pipelining as a similar responsibility as I do forecasting. So I want to own that first and foremost. So I think that is something, at least for me, that work that I was committed to. It's not the most fun aspect of selling. Like we like being with customers. I like being with customers more than I do pipelining. But I learned the hard way that just placing your bets, having all your eggs in one basket is it's a very tricky strategy. I remember I had a year where I was like at, I think 18% of my annual quota, and it was one day before the financial year closed. So it could have been a really bad year for me. Luckily, it wasn't, because a big deal that I was working on the entire year, it came through on that last day, and it was just so much of risk, and not something that I wanted to do to myself or to my business again. And so I just think it's keeping up that habit of pipelining. I think the other thing I would say about pipelining is I think there are two parts to it. Like a really big one is bringing value to customers and having your customers pipeline for you. So that's a great one. It's great to get to that place. And I think as salespeople, that's where we want to get. We want to be adding so much value to customers that they are pipelining for us. So I think that's a big one. And then to be on the lookout of who you can help that doesn't know about you. One of my biggest sales was to a manufacturing company. Now you could say, would they be open to sales tech? Would they be open to LinkedIn? And it turns out that they were interested because I was able to help them with a specific initiative that they had. So like always being on the lookout for who you can help and reaching out to them, and to do that consistently. And of course, LinkedIn is a great place to do that at scale.
Yeah, really good points. There's two things I want to talk about. One of which is around, you talked about getting your customers to do your sales essentially, or at least and help you with the sales side. I'm curious, a lot of that happens organically, like you said, if you do great work. Do you feel like you should spark conversations as well too? And this is something I'm terrible at. So for example, if you had a great project, do you ask for a recommendation? So from another marketer saying, hey, can you introduce me to, we've had a great collaboration so far, I think I might be able to help them. Have you done that as well too, or something you recommend?
Every time.
So I think it's some really good advice for those who, like myself, haven't taken the step to, you mentioned earlier, map out the stakeholder map. And then, once you have a great project, ask those and say, hey, you know what? We've had a good collaboration. Can you introduce us? So that's something for me to do as well. Some good homework. I'd love to hear, are there any other recent projects, obviously without disclosing who they are, take us through the process of what are some of the things that went into the success of that specific win?
So many good ones to choose from. Without talking about a specific project, one of the things that we know is top of mind for companies is diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And LinkedIn has really paved the way over there. And so what we're seeing is that is one of the ways that we've been able to help companies that go beyond the immediate sale. And so that is one example, but I can think of others, companies who are interested in going green, tap into the work that we're doing on sustainability. So for me, it goes back to when I think of the really big wins that we have going on at the moment, we are helping them with pressing issues that go way beyond the solution that we are selling them. And so when I look at some of the top deals we have going on, it's helping them think through and work through some of those pieces.
That's an interesting concept, and one I hadn't heard about or know a lot of salespeople doing is you talked about what are some of the broader topics that organizations are passionate about. You talk about diversity, inclusion, and things like that. But also on a personal level, it got me thinking because I was just having lunch with a marketing leader about an hour ago, and she is obviously head of marketing, but she's also an artist. She's a freelance artist and things like that. So I was putting together a drawing kind of encapsulating kind of what we're doing because she said, hey, can I share what you do with my colleagues? And I was like, okay, you're an artist. I had to put together some kind of drawing. And I took that approach because I knew that she was passionate about, art. And so I tried to frame it in a way where it was easy for her to understand and to take it and run with that. So I think it goes back to what you're saying is finding out what people are interested on a personal level. And I tried this as well. So, for example, we had one COO on the podcast last year, and he's an avid photographer. And we were talking, half the podcast was him just talking, asking me advice for like photography tips and stuff like that. So I think going back to what you're saying at the very beginning, building that relationship, being interested in them, finding out what they're passionate about, either from an organizational point and supporting them that way, or from an individual point, going back to your saying, any way you can help based on what you know about them, I think is great advice that I don't think enough salespeople really do because I think they're so focused on the pipelining and the numbers and hitting their quota that they lose sight of the things that you just talked about.
Yeah, that's so important. Like for me, that's the way that I've always sold because people don't do business with businesses. Like people do business with other people. And I think that's one thing that the pandemic has truly changed, that we're all embracing that we're one person. Like you don't have your work persona and your home persona. I could be here and my kids come in to say hi and I'd be like, Joe, my kids, or you could ask me about the books that I have on my bookshelf. There is being in each other's homes is an invitation to get to know each other better, and that feeling of being connected to each other and seeing each other as human. I feel like that's one big change that has happened in the world of selling. So I think that's very true. It goes back to selling is all about relationships and all about building trust. So going back to people selling to people, I feel like that's a really important one.
Yeah, I think you're spot on once again. And if I think about during COVID, posted, I have a lot of conversations with marketing leaders, sales leaders, but 23% is on talking about kids and, how to keep them entertained during COVID and how not to go crazy. And it's nothing to do with business. It's nothing to do with what they do, but we can both relate to it on a personal level because that's what we're trying to do. So I think, yeah, some really, really good points here that I'm mentally jotting down. I don't have to do more of. So thanks for the reminder. Last question, because you brought up the books, you have this beautiful bookcase for sales leaders. What is one book that you would recommend and one that had a big impact on your career?
Ooh, there are many to choose from. I will show you one. I love this book. It's called Influence. And it has been so interesting to read. And it's about, you have it? Oh my gosh, we're twinning.
That'll be the screenshot right there. Yes.
I love it. What do you think about it?
I think he was really so far ahead in kind of the points. And the book was written, I think, 20 or 30 years ago, probably 30 years ago. And the thing that he talks about in terms of reciprocity, in terms of like social proof, there are still tons of companies, particularly in tech, saying you have to have testimonials and you have to have like star ratings because that'll prove that you're worth to potential customers. And I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so fundamental in terms of not only, building relationships, but also, like you said, on the sales side, just understanding how people think. Yeah, that's one that I've read a couple of times. I don't have as many as you do. The other one that I read all the time is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. But yeah, I think Influence is a great book. If you haven't read it, you've got to check it out. Like I said, you have both of us endorsing it.
We do. Just on the note of influence, I think that's another way that selling has truly changed, that it is about influencing and it's about co-creating versus persuading and versus pushing. And I think this is why I'm so interested in the psychology of influence, because influencing is selling to me.
Yeah, absolutely. You're influencing them to take some kind of action, whether it's in your email or whether it's in proposal, just pulling out some of the key points and sprinkling that in through what you're doing on the sales side. I agree can have a tremendous impact on success of your career. And obviously you have implemented it to great success. Thank you. I really appreciate it. And for everyone watching and listening, do feel free to share Lipika's episodes, some really practical tips on sales and influencing and things like that. So really appreciate you